Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thank you for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. As you heard in the intro, my guest today is music legend Norbert Putnam. He was my guest on episode 151 in September, and he's back because all of his stories wouldn't fit just into one episode. So Norbert, welcome back to the show.
I'll try not to be so long-winded today, okay?
Well, you've had a long lifetime, a long career of storytelling, of stories to accumulate, and we want to hear them.
Well, we're about to do the second printing of my first book, Music Lessons. So I'll go ahead and pitch that out to everybody. There we go. We have a new cover for the reprint. And it's a picture of me playing bass at the last Elvis concert in Memphis. So, he was one of my favorites, but we can talk about him another time.
Okay. So the last time you were here, we talked a lot about Arthur Alexander, Elvis Presley, and Jimmy Buffett. I went after we talked. I went back and listened to some Arthur Alexander songs on Amazon, and I didn't realize that he had recorded "Burning Love" before Elvis did.
I didn't either. No kidding.
Yeah, he recorded it about a year before Elvis.
And who wrote Burning Love? Oh, it was that kid out there in Murfreesboro. Yeah, that was the last hit record Elvis had. Actually, that was his last really big hit in '73, I think. So what do you want to talk about today?
Okay, so
I've worked with two other people,
So normally, I ask a lot of questions that I prepare ahead of time, but I want to do something different with you because you're a great storyteller, and I just want to hear you tell your stories. So I have some names of artists you've worked with, and I want you to tell me about your experience with each one of these names. I'll give them to you one at a time. And you can spend as much time on each one as you want. First, let's start with Kris Kristofferson.
Kris, okay. Kris was a great actor. I don't know if you know that or not. Mm-hmm. I came into Columbia Studios in the late '60s. I was a studio bassist. I played 3 to 4 sessions a day. My first session is Studio 1 from 10 to 1 in the afternoon. Studio 2 from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock. Studio 3, 6 to 9. And about 2 nights a week, I play at 10 to 1 a.m. And if Presley's in town, we go 10 to 5 a.m. I'm still up at 8 the next morning. And that was my life, all right? And so I go to Columbia B one day about 2 o'clock. That's my second session. And I'm playing acoustic bass on that particular session. And I'm setting it up, and this homeless guy comes over, and he had faded out jeans and a faded out black t-shirt and scuffy looking Birkenstock kind of sandals or something. His hair was unkempt. He hadn't washed in a month. And he said, he had a Texas accent. He said, you're Norbert Putnam, aren't you? I said, I am. My name's Kris, and I'm going to be helping out Charlie around here cleaning up. You want me to empty that ashtray? I said, well, Kris, I don't smoke, and it looks like the ashtray's okay. He said, well, it's great meeting you. I'll see you around. And so I was at Columbia Studios. If I played 4 sessions, I would be at Columbia for one of them, right? And I would wave at this guy, Kris. I asked about him, and he was living in the attic of a house nearby. Now, the job he has pays $35 a week, and he's sweeping floors and mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms. And that Texas accent belied the fact that he might be an educated man. So Kris was always really nice to me. And after a couple of months, one day he comes over and he says, you think you could get a beer with me on your break between 5 and 6? So if I play a 2 to 5, I got to sign the cards, get my bass in the car, go to the next studio, maybe grab a sandwich somewhere. In Nashville, you're in tune and in your seat at 6, ready to play, right? And I said, well, I'm thinking he probably needs some money and maybe he needs a good meal. I said, hey, let's go to Ireland's. There's a wonderful pub over here. We get a steak and biscuits. How's that sound? Great. I stopped at the bank and I got $50 to give him. Okay. And so we're sitting at the bar, and I'm saying, so Kris, how are things going for you? That's a bad thing to ask a guy who's sweeping floors. And he said, well, I'm actually up here trying to be a songwriter. Oh, well, a hair on the back of your neck stands up if you're in the music business. He's going to hand me a cassette. Oh, God. So I thought I'd get ahead of him. I said, well, Kris, and I made my standard speech. I said, you and 2,000 other people are walking the streets in Music Row, hoping for a publishing deal, a writer's deal. And I just want to tell you, it's a hard road to hoe, you know. And then he said, well, I've been talking to Scotty Moore. Scotty had a little studio. Scotty was the guy who took Elvis to Sam Phillips, okay, and helped make those records happen. And I thought, you played some songs for Scotty Moore? Yeah, Scotty's going to give me 2 hours. Oh, and he didn't say give me, he said give me. Scotty's going to give me 2 hours of studio. He didn't want me to know he'd studied English at Oxford. So he was acting, you know. I said he was an actor. He was acting. And so I said, so Scotty Moore likes your songs? Yeah, he's going to give me a couple of hours on a Saturday morning from 10 to 12. Oh, and can I get a band together? Oh, okay, Kris, I got to tell you, the only time I see my wife and family is on Saturdays and Sundays because my kids go to school at 7:30. I'm up at 8. I get home at 10. They're asleep. I said, when I can't afford to pay you anything. I said, I'll ask the boys, but that's going to be tough because that's the only chance we have to see our families. And so as the weeks went by, I asked the guys that I normally played with, and they finally said, well, he seems to be an all right guy. If Scotty thinks he's got something, we could come down for 2 hours. Kerrigan, the drummer, said, well, you tell him one thing for me, 12 o'clock, I'm in my car. So we gathered at Scotty Moore's studio a week or so later. At 10 in the morning on Saturday, we've got our coffee. Kris comes in about 9:45, takes his guitar out of a beat-up case over there, and he's got a bottle of something like Southern Comfort. My mother used to give it. It's a good cough syrup, okay? I think he used to make me drink that. And he said, I don't sing really well. I don't want you guys, I'm real nervous. I don't want you guys laughing at me. But I think my songs are pretty good. And he said, I'll just go ahead and play you the first song. And he starts beating his guitar so loud we cannot hear what he's saying, okay? But we're writing out the chords. We're a professional band. So we were writing out the chords. And Scotty said, well, get on the mic and give me a verse and chorus. And so we counted off, and he's over there mumbling, and we're playing. We have no idea what he's saying. So we get all the way through with it. Oh, the headphones were not hooked up that day, and so we can't hear him very well. But we're playing a nice. So we go. Scotty says, "Come and listen." So we go inside, and there comes that gravelly voice. Okay, that Kristofferson voice. My partner David Briggs looked at me and just goes, "This guy's worse than Dylan." But as it got through the first chorus. David and I had a publishing company, and we were used to listening to great songwriters. I looked at David and I said, pretty damn good summation. As a matter of fact, that's a damn good lyric. And he said, yeah, maybe he can write. Well, we quickly did 4 others as fast as we could write them out. And at 12 o'clock, we were out of there. He took those 5 songs, had himself a publishing deal middle of the next week. And about a month after that, Sammy Smith did, I've forgotten the first big hit, what it was called. Help Me Make It Through the Night, I think. Mm-hmm. Okay. And 2 months after that, I'm playing on his record. He's now got a deal with Monument Records. And everybody's saying, this guy is a hot new writer in Nashville. And you know what? I'll tell you the kind of guy he was. He never forgot the favor we did him, okay? And I watched his career blossom. He went from being a singer-songwriter to being a film star. And he would always come into Nashville and call me, and we'd go out and drink. He would tell me stories about making movies and all of this stuff. And I don't know, a few years later, he rang me up and he said, I'm coming back to Nashville. He said, are you doing I can't do his accent here. You playing on those Joan Baez records? He said. I said, yeah. He said, well, could you get me in to meet her? I've got a song for her. And so I called Maynard Solomon Vanguard, who produced her records. And he said, have him come by on Friday night at 6 o'clock. We'll have the playback party. And we will already recorded the album. We did everything live with Joan Baez. And on Saturday night, I went back to Columbia. We had security when Joan Baez came to Nashville. Okay. No one got in the hallways upstairs to Joan Baez. She had marched with Martin Luther in Mississippi, and there was a price on her head. This is the late '60s, okay. And so I take him back there, and they always play it back too loud, and it's blaring. I'm waving, Joni, come over here. I want you to meet this guy, you know. And I said, Joni, this is Kris Kristofferson. And she looked in those big blue eyes and said, send him over to the hotel about 10 o'clock, and I'll talk to him. I didn't hear anything for about 6 months. She calls me one day. She said, well, Kris has been out here and we've been writing songs together. And I want to come back to Nashville. And Kris says you should lead the band and get the younger players. She was working with the older guys in their 40s. I was the youngest guy in her session. And I said, well, David and I have just built a studio called Quadrophony. Would you come to our studio? She said, yes. So great. I got a big star coming to our little studio, right? Well, so I book all the young Nashville cats, you know, my age. See, I would have been about 20, 24, 25 years old. And so we go down to the studio. Oh, Joni said, we're going to do a double record set, 24 songs. So I booked about 15 sessions. I thought we'll go slowly. Oh, Kris is producing. That's right, Kris is producing. So I booked a 2 to 5, 6 to 9, 10 to 1 a.m., 5 days in a row, all the top cats, 15 sessions. So I go down to the studio about 1:30, and Kris is back by the coffee machine, and he's holding on to a half-empty bottle of something, some kind of whiskey. And he's kind of wedged into the corner, and I went over to him, and I said, hey, I don't want you to worry about producing this record. I said, if you go in that control room, sip your whiskey and tell her she's great, the band will make her a great album. And that was true. The Nashville guys didn't need anyone to talk to them. We could hear the voice, the timbre, know exactly what to do. And Kris said, well, I'm not doing it. He said, I don't know what all those knobs and buttons do. And I've been talking to Joni, and we think you should produce the record. You could plug your bass in the desk, recording desk. And I said, I often tell her later, Briggs would have been a better choice, but you couldn't have gotten the piano in the controller. And so 3 nights later, we did The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. That sold 1 million copies, and thanks to Joan and thanks to Kris, started my career as a record producer. So I'll tell you what I think about Kris Kristofferson. He was the finest fellow I ever knew in my life, okay, and a true gentleman. And that was a wonderful story. The two of them combined to, you know, at that point I'd been playing sessions day and night for almost 10 years. The acoustic bass wears you out because it's a bear. Fender bass is a piece of cake, you know, it's like a guitar. And that's how I became a record producer, thanks to Joan Baez and Kris Kristofferson.
Right.
So I thank them in my book immensely.
Well, my next artist that I want you to talk about is very different from Kris Kristofferson. I wanted you to talk about the Monkees, your relationship with the Monkees.
Well, our relationship was with the Monkey. Michael Nesmith, okay, who was the best musician in the band. But the Monkey records were made by the L.A. cats. You know, what do they call them? The
Wrecking Crew.
The Wrecking Crew. Well, the Wrecking Crew had about 100 members. Everybody who played stuff like that was a Wrecking Crew guy. And so Michael, he sort of liked to combine rock music with a little bit of a country flavor. And so he would come down with his pocket full of songs to Nashville. And of course, we would go into RC's big studio, and we'd make our little notes, and he would play it out, and we'd play it back to him. The great thing about the Nashville guys, they could all write music in shorthand, every one of them, because there's no rehearsal for that red light when it comes on. And so even the drummers would sketch out a drum part, knowing where the breaks were, and the rest of us would get everything that was sort of happening from his guitar. Once we heard the timbre of the voice and the kind of accent the guy had, we could morph into that kind of a player. So I was more like a California bassist on those records, you know. And Michael was, he was a joy to work with. Matter of fact, he was so inventive. One day we came in the studio, and he had a whole bunch of the classic country guys there. Buddy Spiker, who was a great country fiddler, but guess what? He could read music as well. Okay. And a great steel player, Lord Green, was on the sessions. Oh, and a banjo paper, Bobby Thompson. We're playing, and Michael's a little late coming to the session. The Beatles had just released Lady Madonna, okay? And Briggs started playing that piano, McCartney piano part. Da 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 yeah, da 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 da. And I jumped in with a do do da da do yet. And so and the country guys jump in and they're jamming this thing, and it was really cool. And since Michael wasn't there, the engineer pushed record. And by the time Michael came in, we were joking around with it. And David Briggs was writing some dirty lyrics to it. He was going to sing it. And Michael listened to it and he goes, this is the next sound in country music. It's going to be this kind of a thing. And we did a song called Listen to the Band. And if all the people out there, go to wherever you get your music and listen to the band, okay, by the Monkees. It was a top 20 record, I guess. But the steel player played a great part on it. Michael went back to LA and put brass on top of it. It really rocked, you know. And yeah, we love Michael. And he had 2 or 3 other really beautiful ballads we did. I wish I could remember all of them. But he was the only Monkee we ever met. You know, he would come down and do his songs. And he would produce his songs the way he wanted, and they would insert them in with all the pop stuff they were doing in LA.
Okay. So the next person I want you to talk about is Donna Summer.
Donna may be the greatest singer I ever worked with my whole life. Dan Fogelberg. We did an album, Dan and I produced an album called Netherlands. And Dan wrote this beautiful song. He had a place up in the mountains of Colorado, up above Boulder. Matter of fact, who owned that thing? One of the LA guys. This thing was up 8,000 feet up. I'd go up to his cabin. I needed oxygen, okay? And so he's up there. He wrote a whole album in the Netherlands of Colorado. And Dan had died. He got cancer. He was living up, he had a ranch out in Colorado. But he always had a house on Deer Isle up near in Maine. I've forgotten a little town there. But anyway, he would go up there at a sailboat there, and he had a pain in the back of the bottom of his spine that kept bothering him. He went to a doctor, and he had a form of cancer that got into your bones. And that cancer, he only lived about a year after he was told that's what he was. He thought he just had a muscle problem. And after he died, his widow called me one day. And she said, Norbert, I've gotten involved with the American Cancer Society. I want to raise money for them. And we're thinking of doing a concert. Could you help us with a concert? And I said, I wouldn't be the guy for a concert. I said, but if you wanted to do a tribute album, I could probably get a bunch of famous singers to do a Fogelberg song. Well, Irving Azoff, the manager, Irving made a call to Sony Records, and they agreed to provide a budget of $10,000 a song, and I would be the senior producer. I think I only ended up producing about 5 of the tracks, because anytime I got a great artist, like out in San Francisco, there was that group Train. Hey, Golds, hey, Soul Sister. They're great, right? Well, they did Same Old Lang Syne, one of Fogelberg's classic songs. And I called him. I said, look, I don't want to produce it because whoever's been producing your records needs to do this, right? And so I ended up producing, Garth Brooks wanted to do Phoenix, which is a real rocker. And I'm thinking, can Garth Brooks sing a song like that? He killed it. Okay. He's singing in Dan's key, had all the big notes on top. I did Garth Brooks. I did the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. A song Run for the Roses about the horses and all that kind of stuff, And well, anyway, it turned out to be a really beautiful project, and we were getting near the end of it. And a buddy of mine called me one day. He was the music director for Donna Summer. And he and I had worked together. We did the Masters theme that you hear every year at the Masters golf tournament, okay? And he said, hey, Donna wants to sing a song on the Fogelberg album. I said, well, give her my number. And Summer calls me, She says, Norbert, I want to sing Netherlands. And you want to sing Netherlands? I said, Donna, I've only got a $10,000 per song budget, which is a pretty good budget for doing one song, But we had a 69-piece orchestra at the Waters Soundstage with Dan's piano. I said, that orchestra will cost $30,000 for one song. And And she said, I really want to do that song because it's about coming to a fork in the road. And she said, it was a problematic time in my life and I couldn't decide what to do. And every day I would play dance thing and I would sing along with it. And I said, you sang along with it? Yes. I said, so you can sing it in his key? Then sing to the you have rather high register. She said, yes, I can get that from the record label. We already own that track. And I said, Donna, so it'll have Dan's piano and orchestra, and we'll put your voice on in place of his voice. Great, she said. I said, well, give me some time because I have to get the analog 2-inch, have it transferred to a hard drive for Pro Tools, and then I'll meet you in LA, wherever you live. And she said, well, I'm going to be busy for the next 2 or 3 months. She said, I have to go and sing for the King of Thailand. He's giving me $1 million. I thought, well, some people are luckier than I am. So Donna flies off, and I get it all transferred. I was living in Jackson, Tennessee at the time, in a lovely old house, in the 1930 house, and in the basement I had my Pro Tools rig with all my monitors. And one day, 3 months later, she suddenly calls me. Norbert, I'm singing good. Can you fly out to LA tomorrow or the next day and let's do that vocal? I had the flu. That was the last time I had the flu. That was 15 years ago. I said, Donna, I've got a fever. I said, you're in LA? I said, book your favorite studio. I'll arrange the payment and your favorite engineer. Cause she was out there working with David Foster. She did a duet with Barbra Streisand. And by the way, killed Barbra Streisand. and so she said, I'll call you back. So she calls me back in about 4 hours. Okay, David Foster's going to let us use the studio at Malibu, and his engineer is great. And Norbert, I'm going to go in. I'm going to go in later, and I'll do a vocal until I like it, and I'll send you the stem, which is just the vocal part, right? I can pull that into my Pro Tools with the orchestra. You can actually send that as a message. So well. So she calls. I don't know, 4 or 5 hours later, and she said, "Now I'm about to send it to you, but I'm holding the studio tomorrow in case you don't like it." I said, "Donna, do you like it?" She said, "I think it's pretty good." I said, "Well, I got a feeling if you think it's pretty good, I'm going to love it." And it comes zipping through the wires. I love modern technology. My wife and I went down in the basement and I pulled it into Pro Tools. I had to line it up, and the orchestra starts, and it's a 70-piece orchestra. And Donna comes in, and goosebumps came up on my arms. Okay, I looked at my wife, and she killed this song, just sold it. So I said, we gotta call Donna. So we get through, and we could hardly talk. We were just so wiped out with this great vocal. And I called Donna. I said, Donna, we're out of breath. I said, it's breathtaking. It's just, I said, I hate to say this, but you really took it to another level past that, Dad. And I just can't thank you enough. She said, well, I'll go and do it again tomorrow if you don't. I thought, well, her producers must have driven her crazy, because she was the greatest singer I ever heard. And that's on the Fogelberg tribute album. So it's Netherlands by Donna Summer. And look for it if you wanna hear her take you to the moon and back with this big 69-piece orchestra. It's one of my favorite recordings.
I need
And
to listen to that. I didn't realize her
oh,
voice
there's
was as good as it is until I heard her sing the national anthem once, and I was
yeah,
blown. It
yeah.
was every bit as good as that Whitney Houston version that everybody knows.
Well, listen to Netherlands, okay? Now I forgot what month it was that this happened. So we're living in Jackson, Tennessee, and 4, 5, 6 months later, my wife comes in. Donna has died. Donna has died. This can't be. And I called Michael, the kid who was her orchestral. I said, what happened to her? He said she'd been battling lung cancer. And only a few people knew about it. He said, I didn't even know. I knew she was unhealthy, but I didn't know it was lung cancer. She didn't smoke. I said, well, where could she have gotten something like it? He said, Norbert, we came in 2 days before 9/11. We came back from a European tour and we were in New York City when the towers came down. And he said, most of us got out of town the next day. But the only thing I can think of, Donna might have breathed some of that debris because she dies then about a year later, And what a loss. I'm so sad. I never ever got to spend time with her anymore.
Wow. Well, speaking of
God bless her.
a loss, a death, the next group I want you to talk about was the Flying Burrito Brothers that you produced after
Yes.
Graham Parsons died. Tell me about that story.
Well, a lot of the guys had left the band by then, okay? There was only a few of the Burrito Brothers really left, okay? And we did it out in San Francisco, and we didn't have the greatest songs they ever had. You know, Clive Davis said, go out there and see if you can. Clive had sent me out there to do the New Riders of the Purple Sage. Oh boy, those guys, they were, I never worked with a band that did a lot of drugs. And the New Riders, I came in one day and they had a tray, a refreshment tray, okay, had a mound of sugar in the middle of it, you know, Thai sticks over here and some Jack Daniels and some Budweiser. They would do all this stuff and then try to play their instruments. So Clive said, well, go out there and see. By the way, I did manage to get a hit record with the New Riders, okay? I was so pleased about that, and Clive was pleased. So I go out there to do the Burrito Brothers, and we didn't have a lot of good songs, but Dan Penn and Spooner Oldham, two people from here in Muscle Shoals. I'm speaking to you from Florence, Alabama. Across the river is the Muscle Shoals area, and that's where I began my career. Well, Spooner Oldham, who was the keyboard player on Aretha's first big hit, Never Loved a Man, that bomb, da 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 dum, and then Aretha came and played some killer piano. Well, Spooner and Dan had written this song. It's called Striking Matches. And it was a really unusual song. It was about, the analogy was burning up a relationship, okay? Was the analogy. And I said to the Burrito Brothers, we didn't have a demo really. I said, what if we'll just fly them out here? We had a great budget. Let's get Spooner and Dan to come out. And they came out. And Dan's trying to teach them a song. And Spooner's kind of playing some piano. And he played great blues piano, okay? But sometimes Spooner had problems that he'd kind of drift off, you know. Well, anyway, so they work up a little arrangement of it. Spooner's playing piano, and Dan is just going to do the guide vocal. Dan had a very soulful voice, and we start striking matches, and it's going pretty good. And got through the first chorus, third verse, second chorus. Spooner played this killer piano thing going into the chorus. So I had them all come in. That's the Spooner. That thing you did going in every chorus. That's a great lick. You know, it's kind of a Ray Charles bluesy kind of thing. He said, well, play that back again for me so I can hear that. I played it back. He goes, I just don't know how I did that. He never played it again, okay? So we did it 4 or 5 times. And I forgot, maybe David Briggs came in later and played it. I can't remember. But that was our shot, and it didn't happen. And I felt badly about it because those guys had made so many great records. And I guess maybe the record I made with them might have been one of the worst records they ever made, you know. But they were wonderful guys. And Clive didn't. He wasn't upset about it. But Striking Matches didn't exactly become a hit record.
Didn't set the world on
Well,
fire.
no, and it didn't help my career any either. I'll tell you that.
All right, well, I got
Luckily,
2 more. Go ahead.
no, go ahead and hit me with what you have. I love surprises.
Yeah, I got 2 more names for you. Next one is Dobie Gray.
Oh God, what a great voice! And one of the most identifiable voices. You know, you knew when Nat King Cole started, it was Nat, didn't you? Well, the same thing with Dobie. And after Dobie came down to our studio, a little studio David and I built in 1970. It's called Quadraphonic. Well, I had the first hit, you know, with Joan Baez. And the next guy to come in, Neil Young, was in town. Johnny Cash had a network television show for a full hour on one of the networks around 7 to 8 in prime time. And Johnny would bring in Eric Clapton, and he would bring in Joni Mitchell. He would bring in all these pop guys. And well, Dobie Gray came to town with Minter Williams, and they booked some time. And Minter had written a song, and Minter's brother, you know, was one of the great songwriters of all time. And Minter had struggled, but Minter wrote that song, Drift Away. Give me the beat, boys, and free my... And I didn't have anything to do with it, but I came to the studio to watch him put the record together, you know. And and so Dobie It took them a while to get that song right. But Drift Away began, and that was the third big hit out of Quad. Neil Young had come in after I did the Baez record to be on Johnny Cash's show, okay? And it might have been Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young that he had on the show. But while he was in town, he decided to come down to the studio. Because they're waiting around. They rehearse on Wednesdays, and then there'd be a day or two, and then they'd do the big show, and they'd all leave. And he said, I want to come in on the weekend. And so James Taylor was in that week, and so was Linda Ronstadt. So they come over to the studio, and James Taylor's playing guitar, and Linda's singing background vocals. And he wrote a song called the big hit, Neil Young's biggest hit record ever, biggest hit record ever had. He recorded
Heart of Gold.
Heart of Gold. Keep me searching for a heart of gold. Yes, 5 million copies sold that year. So we got off to a good start at the studio, and then Dobie comes in right after that and does Drift Away. That was one of the biggest records of the year. So the first 2 or 3 years, we have 3 big multi-million seller recordings there. And my career took off, and I was doing about 7 or 8 acts a year, I guess, as a producer. And I love this because you know what the producer does? He sets the time clock. So when someone would come and wanted to work with me, I said, you got to understand, I only work from 11 to 5 every day. My first wife had left me because I never came home for dinner. And so my life had changed, and I love being a record producer. And I would say, I said to Jimmy Buffett, said, you only work from 11 to 5? You don't work all night? I said, I don't like to waste time. In 6 hours of intense concentration, you can do some great work. The next 6 hours, you're kind of wasting your time, And so, so Dobie later on, at the turn of the 20s, I built a studio down in Memphis. Dobie came over, we did a record together in Memphis. It was the first time I produced him. And boy, what a voice. He'd go out there, very smooth and very, very contemplative and lots of emotion. He was one of my favorite people. I wish I'd spent more time with him.
All right, last name I've got for you before I've got a few more questions. Since I'm in Texas, might as well end this with a Texas legend, Willie Nelson.
Okay. I played on some Willie Nelson records when I first came to Nashville in 65. And this was when he was doing the TV shows and like a cowboy jacket and a little bolero tie, hair slicked back. And the record was kind of like a Glenn Campbell record, okay? Glenn Campbell was the big West Coast country singer, right? And it was a really smooth thing. And Willie was well coughed, and I don't think the record sold 100,000 copies, right? But the funny thing was that Willie liked the band, and we were the Muscle Shoals band. It was me and Briggs and Kerrigan, and piano, bass, and drums. And I don't know if I ever recorded with him again, but he was always sending me messages. He and Waylon went down to where the University of Texas is. That's in
Austin.
What's that town? Austin, yes. And he built a studio down there, and they got their outlaw thing going, And people would come in, and they'd say, hey, I saw Willie, Norbert. He said, say hello to you. Willie was following my career after I started to produce. And I should have gone after him to let me work with him, But he was one of those guys that never forgot you as the years went by. And I only saw him once or twice after that. I've never... Once a year, someone would come and say, hey, I just saw Willie and said, be sure to tell you how much he loved your bass playing. And he's still with us. Willie must be, well, I would have recorded him in 66, 67, and he's still running around. Yeah.
He's still
I think
performing.
Is he 90 now or something?
He's 95.
He'll probably.
I think he's 95.
Yeah. And Kris made it to about 90, And Kris Kristofferson, he was in such great shape. He was a boxer in the military. I don't know if you knew that. But he'd be in the control room and he's playing. He'd jump down the floor and do 50 push-ups as fast as he could do them. And then he'd stand up and do another track. He was in great shape.
I can't imagine
better than any of the musicians.
more intelligent that you worked with in Kris Kristofferson. I just can't imagine somebody. He was a Rhodes Scholar from Oxford. He must have been.
But he still talked in that Texas accent, and I don't know if he was putting that on or not. Now he did make a couple of movies where he didn't use that accent, but I'll tell you, he sure took care of all the people who helped him on the way up. Okay. And I really enjoyed hearing his stories about the movies and the things that he was doing. He told me, he said, yeah, I'm going to do this thing with Barbara Streisand, that Star is Born thing. He goes, I don't know if I can do this or not. Because he was always acting like he couldn't do anything, okay? But he was pretty darn good. He had quite a career. He was no Morgan Freeman, by the way, when I moved to Mississippi, one of the first people I bumped into was Morgan Freeman, and we became dear friends. I was doing some work for the university over there what's that little town? It's a little town south of Clarksdale, Mississippi. Morgan lived there where all the blues was from, it had all these blues guys there. And my friend was having a party at his house, and Morgan was there. I said, "Now you're going to have to introduce me to Morgan, because." And so but I can't find anything. And I see Morgan is going over to the punch bowl. I'll just go. So I walked. I said, "Morgan," I said, "My name is Norbert Putnam, and we might actually have something in common." He looked at me like, "Well, what would that be?" By the way, he's a tall guy. Okay. I said, I did some work with Clint Eastwood after he did all those cowboy westerns in Spain." "You did?" he said. I said, "Yeah, I was a Nashville guy, and I was an arranger, and Clint was about to do a Broadway thing they were making a film of called Paint Your Wagon. And Clint had been taking vocal lessons, and a label in Nashville hired me to wrote strings and woodwinds and the choir and the rhythm section for a record he was going to do." And he said, "You did?" I said, "Yes, I did." And I told him a funny story. I said, I went down to see him on a Sunday night, and we were going to record Wednesday, so I got 2 days to get the charts together. And he was so shy. This is a guy who shoots everybody, right? And he was talking to me, and he was saying, "Now, Norbert, I kind of like, he almost didn't want to look you in the eye." That always upset me when And we got to the studio, and and he was being produced by Don Gant. Okay, and Gant was the guy who produced "Come Monday" on Jimmy Buffett, but refused to use his band, so they sent him over to me. And so Gant is producing it, and Gant's a great singer. And so I go out, and I'm going to play bass and kind of conduct with the neck of my bass the orchestra and the choir, and so it's all beautiful ballads. And so we go out and we run it down a couple of times. And I looked in the control room. I said, "Well, Clint, I think we're ready for you. Come on out." And I can see they're having a conversation in there. Don Gant lays down. He goes, "Norbert, can you come in for a second?" and so I go in the control room. Clint goes, "I can't sing in front of those people." I said, "Well, I said, everybody sings in front of those people. They make records all night and all day." He goes, "Well, Don's going to sing the vocals, and I'll overdub them. Can we do that?" And Don said, well, Don realized he had to do that. So Don Gant came out and sang the whole record, which we did in 9 hours, 12 sides. So we did a 2 to 5, 6 to 9, 10 to 1 a.m. the next morning. And I've got a session it too. And, the next day, Clint's coming in to do his vocals. He said, "Could you come by?" I said, "You got the greatest vocal coach in the world, Don Gant." I said, "Plus, I've only got an hour, so we'll just come for an hour." I don't know why he thought I could be more helpful than the great Don Gant, you know. But I got there just as Clint was getting there, and this is before he has limos and drivers. He had to rent a car, and he had two big tall boys, a 6-pack of tall boys. That was that beer can, it was double size.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to drink those and do his vocals. I didn't ever hear that record. I don't know how it turned out, but he was a sweetheart of a guy. But I don't think I would want to be in a bar fight with him. He'd be running for cover, I think. Unfortunately, he just passed. And everyone, I asked Morgan about working with him. I said, "Morgan, did he ever get over his shyness?" Morgan said, "Oh, did he?" And Morgan told me he was his favorite director because they'd only do one or two takes. And he'd say, "That's fine, let's just move on." So that's all I can say
Was there an
about Clint
artist?
Eastwood.
Was there an artist or a session that completely changed the way you thought about music?
Well, there were more than a few, okay? The first time I worked with Elvis Presley was 1970. And in 1970, I'm just starting to produce all the time, right? And I'm announced I'm not taking any more bass playing sessions. And then I got a call to do Elvis Presley in June of 70. And I thought, I'd like to see what he's really like, because the reason I became a bass player was some kids at school remember my father had an acoustic bass, when I was 15. And so I went over to meet the great Presley. And the guy he was a genius. He could learn a song he never heard before in about 10 minutes. And the first take he did would be killer. And then I got called to do a television show with Ray Charles. Now, so those are my two top guys. Ray was the greatest purveyor of emotion I ever heard, okay? And played the greatest piano I ever heard. And of course, between Elvis and Ray, that was sort of it for me in the 60s. And so I went down to WLAC television studios, that country hillbilly show called Hee Haw. And the country singer from Bakersfield, I'll think of his name, he had done it.
I can't think of his name either.
Oh, isn't it?
Buck Owens. Buck Owens.
Buck Owens. Well, Buck had done a couple of duets with Ray, and they were big sellers. So Ray's coming in to sing a couple of those duets on Hee Haw. Well, I was never called to do the Hee Haw had a country type band, and Charlie McCoy called me. He said they want to get a more hip rhythm section for Ray. I said, well, coming up in bands when I was 16, 17, 18 years old, we played every song Ray Charles ever did, from What I Say to Hit the Road Jack to Georgia on My Mind. So I walk into the band, and it's all this young cats in their 20s. And Ray comes out, and they sit him down at the piano. He said, well, you know who I am? He said, who are you guys? And we said, well, we're just a bunch of studio guys. He said, do you know any of my songs? And almost in unison, we said, Ray, we know all of your songs. He said, I bet you don't know this one. Well, he went into Georgia on My Mind. It's got some beautiful changes in the middle of it. We played it flawlessly. He said, you play pretty good for white boys. We said, how would you know? And everybody laughed. And about that time, Buck Owens comes out and sits down, and Ray's got his mic, And so we played the two Buck Owens things. Charlie McCoy had written charts for us, so we didn't have to write our own charts. So we one take, and Buck is running to another soundstage. And Ray's sitting there. He goes, you want to play a few more tunes with me? So he was liking the way we played. And so we did another classic. Now the producer's back there, and they're winding the tape. And I watched the red light come on. He decided he'd go ahead and record it. We did 5 or 6 more songs with Ray. He finally got off the piano and started dancing around. He was bumping into lights and cameras, and then he was gone. But for about 30 minutes there, that was some of the greatest playing and singing I'd ever heard in my life. And I could scratch off Ray Charles. I scratched off Elvis, And after that, it was, I enjoyed a lot of the orchestral sessions. Al Hurt would come up from New Orleans. We'd have a 50, 60-piece band, 4 trumpets, 4 bonds, 20 strings, a choir. And we did the Great American Songbook, all the Gershwin, Cole. That was pretty good for a bunch of kids in Muscle Shoals to start out just playing R&B,
That's pretty cool. So you spent a lifetime. Yeah, you spent a lifetime telling stories through sound. What did you learn about
Well,
human nature by watching artists bare their souls in front of a microphone?
well, if you wanted to be a successful studio player, and by the way, that was the greatest job you could have, okay? If you could master about 7 or 8 different styles of music. I would listen to Nancy Wilson records on the West Coast. Buster Williams played bass for her, and I would steal licks and Buster would play on the acoustic bass. And I'd find a place to use them, And when Henry Mancini came in, it was upright bass. and he wrote every note I played on the record, And with Al Hurt, Al liked the Fender bass. And of course, I could kill the Fender bass. And I had everywhere on the Fender. And so we're doing the Great American Songbook with Al Hurt. And Al, we would work a 10 to 1, 2 to 5, okay? That's 8 songs done by 5 o'clock. And we're going to come back the next morning, 10 to 1, 4 more, that's 12 for an album. And the average takes was 2 to 3 takes. We play it once, and we play it again, we listen to it, and we play it again, that's it. And then we take a break, And I would say, hey, Putt, he called me Putt, and David was the key. Hey, Putt and David, want to go down the alley and scarf some food? I said, David, what does scarf mean? He said, I don't know, I think it's we're running. Have you ever heard scarf some food?
Yeah, eating fast, eating quickly.
Well, he would get 2 porterhouse steaks. Al was a big guy, okay? And he had this amazing chest cavity. One morning we're doing an album of Bert Kaempfert songs. Bert wrote Dankeschön. He wrote all these ballads that came out of Europe. Spanish Eyes. Spanish Eyes. Da 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 dee, da 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 dee. Well, so we got 4 trumpets and 4 bones, right? And the trumpet section's going to play unison with Al. Al looks over and said, hey, boys, let's just take a deep breath and play that first 16 without taking a breath. I thought, he can do it, but they can't. So we start, and Al goes, da, da, dee, da, 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 dee, da, da. They're ready for it. So one by one, the trumpet players folded over and fell on the floor. Al thought that was just the grandest thing in the world. So he had we had fun on those sessions, all right? And of course, Al was a Curtis Institute trained trumpeter. He actually got his start. He came up to New York. Doc Severinsen and Clark Terry were the 2 big guys on the Tonight Show band, and they heard him, Al play. And Al said, if either you can't make a record date, put me in there. Excuse me. And one day, Doc got a call from the guy who conducted the New York Philharmonic, Lenny Bernstein. Lenny called him. They were doing a Puccini piece, and the first trumpet player was out with the flu. And he called Doc to see if he'd come and play it. And Doc said, I can't. I've got NBC Orchestra, and so does Clark. He goes, do you know anybody can play this Puccini piece? And Doc said, okay, lady, I got a guy, but you have to do one thing. He said, what's that? He goes, you don't say anything to him until you hear him play. He knew this big, heavy New Orleans kind of guy was going to walk in. And so supposedly, Lenny's got the whole orchestra there, and Al walks in, and Lenny looks at him like, this guy can't play the trumpet. But he couldn't say anything. And so Al gets his horn out and just kills the Puccini piece. They said that Lenny ran over and draped himself over his body because he wanted to cheek. And that's how Al Hurt became a legend in New York City. And he got a record deal after that.
Nice. So I've got two more questions for you as we wind up the conversation today. So this one.
Sorry about my.
That's okay. We got editing.
So I'm sorry.
So for the
Good.
next
Well, I'm
last
ready
question.
for you.
So if you could gather the old Muscle Shoals crew for one more session, what song would you want to cut?
I'm sorry. My headphones are a bit of a problem. No, they're good. Go ahead. Say that again.
Okay. All right. Let me ask you again.
Yeah.
If you could gather the old Muscle Shoals crew for one more session, what song would you want to cut?
Okay, I don't know, but I want. You remember we talked about Arthur Alexander, right? That first hit made Muscle Shoals because the record only made the top 20 in America, but it came out in England and in Liverpool. Brian Epstein ran the record shop for his family. They had a little department store. He handed it to John Lennon, and Paul McCartney liked the B-side of You Better Move On, which is called Get a Shot of Rhythm and Blues, because they could play that in the Cavern Club. And the A side was done by the Rolling Stones. It was the first piece of music out of Florence, Alabama, and Muscle Shoals to make money. But after that record was done, we never worked with Arthur again because Rick gets to Nashville. He couldn't sign a deal with anybody. And he met a payola disc jockey who had a connection with Dot Records. And he said, if I get the Dot deal, you have to cut me in as producer. Well, the contract Rick signed, the guy stole Arthur, and we didn't work with him again. But they had a couple of good records after that. But I would have given anything to work with Arthur Alexander again. He was a handsome guy, great personality, great voice, and I think he would have had a much longer career if Rick Hall had kept him for a bit longer. So I regret losing him. But at the moment, I can't think of anybody else that really stands out. And you know, Arthur was cheated out of all of his writing money. He ended up driving a bus in Cleveland in his 40s. And it's one of the great tragedies of things that happened in the 60s in music.
I was
God
just thinking how
bless
much money
Arthur
he could have
Alexander.
made from Elvis re-recording his song "Burning Love."
Yeah, yeah. Well, yes, he was, and you know, he did go over and play in England. And McCartney and George Harrison and I became friends afterwards. Okay, when I was a producer, mid '70s, and Paul and John Lennon. He said John Lennon loved Arthur Alexander. He said when he got that first record, "You Better Move On," he sang with it for 2 weeks, trying to get the accent down. The accent was, and you know, and John never quite got the accent. But all of that music, you know, the blues and R&B was so big with all the European bands. Eric Clapton, his whole career was based on the blues. It basically came out of the Mississippi and Chicago.
It's really interesting and sad too how so many black artists from the 50s and 60s had to go to England to get popular before they could come back to their home country and start going on concerts and touring and stuff like that.
Well, you know, a lot of them moved there. You know, Tina Turner, she was so they loved her so much that she moved to France, I think, or Italy. She lived in for the rest of her life, and she was a major star. There was a little girl from Laurel, Mississippi, named Leontine Price, who became one of the greatest opera singers in the world. And I don't think she ever came back to Mississippi. Why would you? Because she sang in all the great halls of Europe, you know. Yeah, America, you know, we had problems then, we have problems now, and I'm hopeful that we solve some of our problems soon. You know, it's something that I will be praying about tonight.
All right, for the final question for today, this was just for fun. What's one piece of studio
Okay.
advice you wish every young musician could have written on the wall before they hit record?
Well, as a player, the thing that if you wanted to be a great studio player, you never play a bad note. I would go on Monday morning before I began my week. I would stand in front of the mirror when I was still shaving a little bit, and I would say, "Okay, Putnam, no bad notes this week." Because all the older players, I never heard them play a bad note. The producer would say, Grady, swap parts with Floyd Kramer on that intro. The red light comes on. Now, Floyd has no chance to rehearse anything. He plays the greatest intro you've ever heard. Okay? They could do this. They're double my age. I'm sitting thinking, I'll never be this good. And so the thing that I came away with was you're listening to this voice and you're listening to this song, you're writing a chart. My first idea I have for that bass part is my best idea. Okay. And that has served me really well. And I think that applies almost to any creative thing you do because your second idea is based on criticism of the first idea. And then you start going down this hole, right? And so I will say I got so good at it at one point that I would just maybe put one of my fingers on the first note. I don't even know what I'm going to play. And magically, I would start to play this part. It's almost like my brain was willing to take over for me. But later on, I talked to Mancini about that. That was something Henry said. He said, yes, your first idea, write it down and go with it. And because that's coming straight from your heart. Everything else is based on judgment. You don't want to judge. So I would just tell any player that wants to be a studio guy, or if you want to write a piece of music, you want to write lyrics, that first idea about that lyric, stay with it.
All right, that's a good way to end the episode today. So our guest today has been Music Hall of Famer Norbert Putnam. Norbert, thank you again for being here. I'm really honored to have you back.
Well, it was my pleasure. Sorry about my voice today. I
That's
sound
okay.
like Kris today. Thanks,
Well,
Val.
please go to my website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guest and the things we discussed today, including a link to his new reissue of his book. So that's it for today's
Yeah,
episode of
Music
Stories from
Lessons
Real Life.
Volume 1. Yeah,
Yes, here's a copy right here,
thanks.
and he'll have a new
Thank you
cover.
so much.
So that's
And
it
it'll
for today's
be
episode of Stories
available.
from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.